All right, so here we are, Johnny Tremain by Esther Forbes and illustrated by Lynd Ward, published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. We're in chapter 7, and the last section was awesome. Section 3 was about Johnny riding for, he rides for the British, he also still rides for the Observer, and how now Dove is a stable boy working for the British officers, and he's kind of still the butt of everybody's jokes and still getting beat up on by everyone, but Johnny just kind of lets him have it. Then there's a lieutenant who wants to acquire Goblin for his commander, for the colonel, and so the lieutenant tries to commandeer, or basically take Goblin for a cheap price. And so Johnny knows that Goblin is potentially tough to ride. So while the lieutenant is taking Goblin out for a ride, Johnny helps the hotel worker with the laundry, and she's shaking out the sheets, and he says, here the guy comes on the last part of his lap around the block, so help me with this sheet. And he flaps it in the wind with her, and Goblin just rears up, and the lieutenant falls off into the mud, and Johnny is like he's got his back turned. He and Lydia have their backs turned so that it's kind of like, they're not watching what they just did on purpose. And it's so interesting. I love the character development here. It's really that the lieutenant respects what Johnny just did so that Johnny could keep the horse. Because if Goblin had been the perfect horse, then the lieutenant would have purchased him, and Johnny would have been without a horse. So basically, Johnny did a great thing by showing Goblin for what he is, which is a little bit skittish, and then the lieutenant wasn't going to buy him, of course, because he ended up in the mud, and then he tells his colonel, oh no, this horse is too skittish, I wouldn't pay 15 shillings for him. So, haha, that was a trick, that was good, that was fine. So, anyway, section 4, here we go, and it did mention at the end here that Rab is training with the armed forces. Not much, but Johnny is bored and Rab is drilling with the army. So let's read section 4. As he came back from Milton, riding the long, lonely stretch of the Neck with the gallows and the town gates still before him, Johnny realized how long ago it was that he had burned his hand, and how he had hated Dove when he found out the part he had played in that accident. How he had sworn to get even with him, the lying hypocrite, telling old Mr. Lapham that all he had meant to do was to teach a pious lesson. Now, as he saw Dove daily about the Afric Queen, he could hardly remember this feeling of hatred. He could hardly remember this feeling of hatred. His oaths of vengeance. My goodness, Johnny is changing. Seemingly, hatred and the desire for revenge do not last long. He had made new friends. The old world of the Lapham shop and house was gone. Yet he remembered old Mr. Lapham, who had died that spring with more affection than when he had been serving under him. Even Mrs. Lapham now did not seem so bad. Poor woman, how she had struggled and worked for that good, plentiful food, the clean shirts her boys had worn, the scrubbed floors, polished brass. No, she had never been the ogress he had thought her a year ago. There never had been a single day when she had not been the first up in the morning. He, like a child, had thought this was because she liked to get up. Now he realized that there must have been many a day when she was as anxious to lie abed as Dove himself. He remembered when there was no money to buy meat, and how she would go from stall to stall until she found a butcher who would accept payment by a new clasp on his pocketbook, or a fishwife who would exchange a basket of salt herrings for a black mourning ring. Her bartering and bickering had then seemed small-minded to him. Now he was enough older to realize how valiantly she had fought for those under her care. True, Madge would make another of those big-fisted, hearty women, but women can be worse than that. He thought with some pity of Dorcas and her craving for elegance. Was she never, no, not once, to eat off china? Always nothing but pewter? Poor girl, she'd not lived too high with Frizzle Jr., but Johnny wished her well. Priscilla Lapham. Ever since Rab had taken her home and left Johnny to eat 6 fried eggs by himself, he had felt differently about Scylla. She had been his best friend during the years he worked at the Laphams, and then for some months she had been a drag on him. He had not bothered much with her. Overnight, that had changed. He was always looking forward to Thursdays and the seed cakes and the half-hour sitting out under the fruit trees with Scylla. And sometimes he would see Miss Lavinia Light. Then Johnny would hold his breath a moment and enjoy the chill that went up his spine. His feelings for Isana had changed too, and not for the better. It would break Scylla's heart if the little girl did not live up to her lovely face. But Johnny had not liked it that last Thursday, when he had been sitting on the back stoop with Scylla and Miss Lavinia, had driven up in her smart whiskey with a red coat beside her, and Isana wedged in between. It could not be possible Isana had not seen him, but she had glanced at him and then looked away. Johnny rode through the town gates, telling his business to the British sentries there. Sentries are people who watch, and they are guarding the gate. Then went first to report to Paul Revere. A family of Tories in Milton wished to move into Boston and had written Colonel Smith about this move. Although a great many of the Whig families were moving out of the town, a great many of the Tories, frightened by the rough treatment they were getting in the inland towns, were moving in to be under the protection of the British troops. Then, as he had been thinking about the Laphams all the way over from Roxbury, Johnny decided to stop in and see them. He had not been in this house once since Mrs. Lapham and Mr. Tweedy had been so ready to cast him off for the sake of Mr. Light's patronage. The squeak pig was alone in the shop. He had not so much as one boy to help him with his fires or to sweep his shop. He liked to work alone. Johnny saw that he was mending the silver hilt of a British officer's sword. "What are you doing here?" he muttered crossly at Johnny. Johnny took off his spurs and showed the silversmith a broken rowel. "I want you to fix that for me this afternoon, Mr. Silversmith." "Yes, sir, yes, indeed." Once Johnny was a patron, the past was forgiven him. "If you'll take a chair, it shall be mended in 15 minutes. Johnny couldn't help it. He said proudly, "In 10 minutes, Mr. Silversmith." "In 10 minutes, sir." He walked into the kitchen. There was nobody about, but he could smell bread rising. He looked in the birth and death room. It was once more used for storage. It seemed strange beyond belief that he had ever lain so long in the room. And in a way, he had died in that room. At least, something had happened, and the bright little silversmith's apprentice was no more. He stood here again at the threshold, but now he was somebody else. Then he went outside to the little backyard with the coal house, the privy, and the old willow. Underneath the willow sat a British sergeant of Marines with Madge Lapham in his arms. He had rather guessed the Laphams would side with the Tories, but this was fraternizing with the troops at a great rate. The sergeant was not half as big as Madge, but he was holding her in his lap. It is hard to hold even a small child very long in such a position. Johnny thought the sergeant must be very tough. They heard his feet and both looked up at him. Johnny laughed, as did the sergeant and Madge. She said, "Just so it isn't Mother." And she twisted and yearned down into her small lover's eyes. The bigger they come, thought Johnny, the harder they fall. Madge certainly likes that sergeant. Sergeant dear, she said, I'd like to make you acquainted with an old friend of the family. But Johnny, how you have grown. I don't know whether to introduce you as Johnny or Mr. Tremain. Johnny had grown. Much of the last year had been spent out of doors and on horseback, and now he was always out in the sun and wind. Just Johnny. Sergeant Gale, dear, this is Johnny Tremain. They both agreed they were glad to meet. Gale, whose legs must have been badly cramped, picked up Madge as though she were a pet cat and sat her down beside him. The little man must be prodigiously strong, thought Johnny, and he liked his ugly lined face. He looked just about as tough as they come, even in the Marines. Madge, whom he had always liked the least of the Lapham girls, was rosy, glowing, and beaming. He had always heard that love was a wonderful thing. If it could make Madge Lapham so pleasant, he was ready to agree. Sit down, Johnny, and tell us about yourself. There's not much to say, I'm making out. Isn't Isana in luck? Taken right into the family like a little sister. Pfft, like a pet poodle dog, Johnny said firmly. My, you haven't changed much. You always were sort of jumping on other people. I still jump. How's Mrs. L? Don't mention her, said Sergeant Gale. Ma says I've got to marry Mr. Tweedy. He doesn't want to, and I don't want to. Oh, Johnny, you're too young to understand, and I guess Ma is so old she's forgotten. I can't marry Mr. Tweedy. Not since I met Sergeant Gale. I'll not say, or I'll say not, said the Marine. Madge, in case you've been wondering, is going to marry me, aren't you? You toothsome, plump suet pudding. The skinny little red rascal evidently liked his ladies plump. Johnny went back to the shop, paid Mr. Tweedy for his work, and buckled on his spurs. He had enjoyed his visit to the Laphams. Mr. Tweedy had bowed to him, called him sir, and rubbed his hands in gratitude for even this small favor. Madge so pleasant, and the smell of Ma's good bread rising. Goblin, tied to the head of the wharf, was pawing, turning toward him and nickering. As he settled himself in the saddle and the horse moved off down Fish Street, he thought it had been a nice visit, but he would not go again. That was all over. And so is section 4, and so is this video. Click subscribe and come on back to the next one. See you guys on the next video.